Long Island Bridge, Moon Island, notice of intent filed by the City of Boston, continued case. Applicants proposing to replace the superstructure of the Long Island Bridge between Moon Island and Long Island. Portion of the project in Quincy involves placing new bridge spans over existing piers and improving the bridge storm water system. Coastal resources and coastal beaches, coastal banks, land subject to coastal storm flowage. This is a continuation of our July. Because we didn't have a quorum in August, and we have our original quorum of 4 members, so we can continue it. I'm just looking at my package to make sure we have everything. I've got the original notice of intent, the Quincy consultants' questions that were raised in June, the Boston response that was filed July 13th. Then City of Boston submitted changes to the plan on July 31st. Quincy then had response to the Boston's response on August 21st. Then Boston issued a letter of response to Quincy on August 28th. Quincy now has issued, the most recent one is their concrete report, as I call it, September 3rd, and Boston submitted on September 5th response to that. Is that our universe?
That does seem like our universe. Sam Rothman had.
One point of clarification. I'm Sam Moffett from TRC. I'm not sure what you're referring to with a change of plans. I'm not sure what that is.
July 31st, Long Island notice of project change. Notice of project.
Oh, that's the
MEPA filing.
That's the MEPA filing.
Just a point of clarification.
Yeah, I use the one.
Thank you.
The MEPA filing where you just, one of my, okay, thank you.
No problem. So I'm Chris Osgood. I'm here with the city team. Delighted to be back. As you noted, for the third time. Obviously, we've been engaged in a lot of correspondence since May and a lot of conversations, especially before that. The team here is, again, we're happy to be back. We're here if you have interest. We can sort of present, again, the overall project, the approach that we're taking. As we did back in the June meeting, we're also happy to answer any questions you have about any of the correspondence, the original submission in May, the MEPA filing, the July submission, to your questions, the August answers to your questions as well. I'm also happy to hear, obviously, from the elected officials in Quincy, as well as any members of the public who want to provide testimony on this. Overall, as you know, our interest is to rebuild the Long Island Bridge so that we can reopen our recovery campus on Long Island that really can serve folks across this entire region. So I'm happy to take your lead, whether it's answering questions, re-providing the presentation, or hearing testimony from people.
And as an alternative, we have paper copies of the presentation, if that would be a lower impact, easier solution for the members.
Okay. We'll proceed. Are you going to give an overview then?
Great. Well, I'll turn it over to Sam, who will sort of walk us through a quick overview of the project.
Thank you. Just need to make sure this gets lit up the way I want it. So hopefully this will fire up here in a second. People will recall we filed our notice of intent on May 17th, excuse me. We were here for our first presentation on June 6th, and on June 6th we provided this presentation, which is pretty skewed, and I apologize for that. Kind of jury rigged here. The project was from the very beginning, the direction that we received from the City of Boston. I'm with TRC, the environmental consultant. With me here is Nicole Bulger and Bill Goulet from STB, which are they're representing the design engineer for the project. We were advised by the city that we were to design a solution, a project, and a construction approach that would minimize impacts to wetlands. That was our number one priority, because we understood the importance that both Boston and Quincy were going to place on protection of environmental resources. So we designed a project, the STV team, designed a project that minimizes construction activities that are in Quincy, It provides a new bridge superstructure that has improved stormwater performance relative to the old superstructure, that is going to be safe for 75 years, and also is designed with potential sea level rise, climate adaptation in mind, with higher elevations. And we remain confident, as we were when we first presented this to the Commission back in June, that we've met all of these directions. The superstructure has, we're calling it the same roadway profile. We're using the same piers, and I know that's a subject that has generated an awful lot of interest, and we're looking forward to answering questions that people have. But by using the same piers, we are able to avoid work that is in the water that's going to alter the floor of Boston Harbor. The higher clearance, as I said, to provide climate adaptation and resiliency, stormwater management, and we also have met Coast Guard requirements with respect to the navigation channel, which is on the Boston end of the structure. The old bridge, people will recall, had a truss, was built about 50 years ago, and as people can see, it had run through its design life and needed to be replaced. The new proposed superstructure, there's an image down here below, is characterized once again by a truss, the navigation span, and also by new delta frame supports on top of each of the piers. This is going to provide a sleeker profile, and once again, the sea level rise is illustrated on this figure, and this shows that the tops of the piers and the road surface itself are elevated relative to the old structure. With respect to alterations of wetland resource areas or buffers in Quincy on Moon Island, we, as I said, went to great lengths to find a solution that would allow us to minimize temporary or permanent alterations. And they're illustrated on this, which is also in the NOI that was submitted, but down here in the fine print, I regret that it's still fine print even though we're projecting this on the screen here, but the punchline is that what we have proposed is no alteration of land under the ocean. That's a zero, and we continue to stand by that assessment and feel very comfortable in making that assessment. We have 80 square feet of temporary alteration of coastal beach and land containing shellfish, and that is associated with our proposal to put two, excuse me, they're here, you can barely see them, 4 pipe piles driven into the coastal beach area to support a temporary trestle, which will facilitate construction of the last span of the bridge. Again, we've minimized their pipe piles that will go in and then be removed and with their work. We also have characterized this temporary alteration here within the coastal bank. I think there was some confusion over the course of the summer about what exactly we were talking about in that area. The old structure had a pier, another what was called Pier 1 at this location, and the foundation of Pier 1 has, the superstructure of it has been removed as part of the demolition of the old structure, but the concrete foundation is still present in the field. And what we're proposing is to utilize that hard surface to place temporary structures on to, once again, facilitate the construction of the final span. So there's no permanent alteration of coastal bank in that area. It's using existing concrete foundation, bringing in the structure with rubber-tired vehicles. There's no, to be conservative, we included that in our NOI, but we're comfortable in saying that it's a very minor temporary alteration that we're talking about in that location. And again, improved stormwater performance because we're providing the stormwater system on the bridge to treat stormwater that falls on the bridge structure in accordance with the Massachusetts stormwater policy. And this figure here is the non-intertidal area. This is from the municipal boundary between Quincy and Boston out in the harbor back towards Moon Island. And as you can see, there's no impact in this area that we are proposing. Once again, we described in the NOI, we've also described in the notice of project change that we submitted to the state, to the NEPA office of the state, that the city is proposing to do repair work to the piers, but the repair work to the piers is going to be in the dry. It's not going to include cofferdams. It's not going to include activities that are going to alter the floor of the harbor. And through the specifications that will be the basis for the city procuring a contractor to do this work, there will be a requirement that the contractor is not allowed to work in the water and do any activities that impact the floor of the harbor. And he's going to be required, he or she is going to be required to use best management practices, structural best management practices to prevent any debris from being released into the harbor during the repair of the piers. So this, again, this is a figure that shows the piers, the existing piers. And this shows the repair work that will be proposed. And I'll let one of my colleagues speak to the engineering details of that.
Thank you, Sam. I'm Nicole Bulger. I'm with STV Incorporated, the designer of record for the project. This is, again, something that we presented back in June, so no change. It simply shows you, again, our typical pier elevation. You'll see here that we have our proposed limit of demolition. We're taking the top of the pier cap off. We're installing post-tensioning to strengthen the concrete core of the pier. We're repointing and repairing the granite facing of the piers, and we're building a new concrete cap. This was all included in the notice of intent, but just to clarify everything that's being done. Again, this goes through the staging of what I just described. We take down the top of the existing pier cap, remove the granite from the top, place a new concrete cap after we have installed these post-tension strengthening rods.
The strengthening rod, just,
Sure.
is that something that's drilled in to
Yes,
existing?
into the top of
There's
the
no pier
center
there.
of the pier, though. We're not out, we're all, everything happens within the footprint of the existing pier.
Right now it's solid granite and you're putting the post in.
So they take off the granite cap and demolish the concrete down as needed, and then they drill down into the concrete with the strengthening right through the core.
And so we have included in the NOI a designated area where the contractor, we would propose for the contractor to be allowed to, during high tide, tie alongside barges to bring equipment over to Moon Island. And the concept at this point is that there will be a crane, a large piece of equipment will be required at this location to facilitate the movement of girders, steel elements of the bridge span into place. We've identified this area as kind of a worst case assessment of where the contractor would be allowed to tie alongside to transship materials or equipment onto the paved parking lot here at the Island and then move it over towards the abutment area, the bridge construction recognize the importance of minimizing the impact on the city of Quincy and minimizing traffic on the city streets of Quincy. We've prepared and presented an approach here that we feel pretty comfortable minimizes that particular potential impact. The final point I'll make on this, because I know this is something else that's been raised as a question at various times over the course of the summer, is through the specifications, the City of Boston is going to stipulate that the contractor selected to do the work is not allowed to bottom out his barges at that location. And I'll say contractors, because the barges that they own are valuable pieces of equipment, they're not really inclined to allow their barges to bottom out in any event because they're concerned about the risk of damage to equipment. So that's the presentation that we provided last spring. Again, very minor coastal wetland alterations have been proposed in this NOI. We stand by the impact numbers that we presented back in May and initially presented to you in this presentation on June 6th. And once again, no alteration of land under the ocean is proposed in this NOI. Very minor alteration of coastal beach and land containing shellfish, temporary to facilitate construction. This 512 square feet of coastal bank, once again, is the footprint of the foundation area under the former Pier 1, where Boston is proposing to put temporary structures on top of an existing foundation. And when they demobilize, take that steel back away again, and leave that concrete pad where it is. They're not proposing to change the resource area permanently. And once again, we've in effect double counted 592 square feet of land subject to coastal storm flowage, which is a combination of these two numbers here, because they happen to correspond to land subject to coastal storm flowage. And there is a small area of, we're proposing this permanent buffer zone alteration up at the abutment area, the approach roadway, which is to improve the geometry of the approach roadway. And it's outside of the resource area, it's in this buffer zone area, and you can't even really quite see it, but it's a little sliver right there because they need to provide safe geometry for 2 lanes to access the roadway. The pavement needs to be just a touch wider on one side. Once again, it's buffer zone alterations, and that was intentional. We did everything we could to avoid resource area alterations. So I think that's all the presentation we provided back in June. And again, as Mr. Osgood said, we're very happy to answer questions. And we are hopeful that by the conclusion of tonight's hearing, the members of the commission may be inclined to close the hearing, and we can move forward one way or the other.
I'll just note, I did see in the NEPA file, and I raised questions about alternatives analysis, and you did provide some in the NEPA. Not everybody will agree with that, but I did see that in the no build and ferry service alternatives. Any other questions?
Well, is he familiar with this?
Yes, the most recent one. Yeah, we'll address that in a minute.
He is aware, okay.
And I think the other concern that I had was the pier repair work. From what I remember, the photographs from June was there is some deterioration below the water surface, and you're not going to do any work below the water surface. How are you going to address that?
I'll refer that again to our colleagues in this team.
There will be repair work performed below the water level, but it will be, there are structures that can be attached to the pier water from the top. It's a containment structure. And so most of that work would be performed at low tide. So it's below what we would call a mean high water line, but it would be still some work that they could perform in the dry, either by pumping out something that's attached to the pier itself, not touching the seafloor, or just with the regular tidal fluctuations. There's a large tidal fluctuation out there, as I'm sure you know.
But some of the debris that's in the pointing now, that will end up on the seafloor.
No, they'll be required to build a containment system around the pier, attached to the pier, so that the debris would be captured.
And that's
fully.
like 100%.
That, it should, I would recommend that it be a condition. That's something that the commission is likely concerned about, but that's the way that the contract documents are being written as well.
And that's a temporary containment, you're not putting
Yes.
permanent containment.
Now, this would be a temporary construction-related containment system.
What's that containment made of? How is it?
There are different alternatives for that, so we would consider that the contractor's means and methods, but there are various systems available for that type of thing.
I know there's a couple of points that the city wants to address with their consultant. Do we have any more questions now, or do we want to?
I have one question, I guess, about the stormwater performance. So you said it's going to be improved. Is that compared to the older bridge, correct? Not, because right now there's no stormwater performance.
Correct.
compared.
The old structure was equipped with very minimal stormwater management facilities and essentially drained to the harbor. You have to maintain safety on the deck, you have to get the stormwater off. And the old structure, it just went to the harbor. Now, what we're proposing is to, with catch basins and pipes, convey stormwater to pre-treatment. And then, again, Ms. Bulger is the designer, so she's the better person to speak to.
So we use typical bridge scupper system that collects the water, runs it back to the abutments where it goes through, is routed through a storm scepter unit, and then discharges back into the tidally influenced area. So
And do you have a percentage of how much stormwater is caught through that system, or?
it should be all of it.
All of it?
It's sized differently. The idea being that even from a public safety perspective, as Sam mentioned, being with the water box it was.
At this point, I'm gonna, the city we have a consultant that has addressed some of the issues and issued a recent report. Should we hear from them first?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask for a brief recess. The team is downstairs, I've been in touch with them.
Okay.
I'm gonna go get them. But I did have one question about the storm scepter system. How do you protect that from freezing?
It's typically below the frost level, right?
But it's in the ocean, just
No,
curious.
the storm scepter is actually back behind the abutment in the earth. It's a typical installation for this type of thing.
But how does
It's
it
not
get all the
actually on the
way,
bridge itself.
how did it get all the way from the middle of the bridge to the storm scepter?
That's the piping system. It's a standard bridge piping system similar to what's used by Mass DOT.
So it won't freeze above the water line? I was just curious.
Just ask for a couple minute breaks.
Is the team here? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I didn't see them here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, we have three people that are going to present on behalf of the city of Quincy, their coach, and their professional staff. Although I did introduce myself way back on June 6th, I'd like to take the opportunity to say hello again. I'll let you know who I am. My name is John Shea. I'm an environmental lawyer with the environmental law firm of Mackey Shea in Boston. I have been practicing wetland law for 36 years, both permitting, appeals, enforcement, and teaching. I've been mostly an applicant and commissioner's lawyer in review of projects from Truro out to Lenox and everywhere in between. And I was chair of a conservation commission for 8 years, so I can understand the challenges of the many meetings and complex projects that you have to deal with. I am pleased to be working with the really excellent engineers and scientists at Ty and Bond, and with extremely knowledgeable city staff who provide a historic perspective and perspective on how other projects have been handled that would be lost if they weren't involved in the process. Since June 6th, when I last addressed the commission, and when Ty and Bond and the commission demanded that the Boston Public Works Department submit additional information to you, the city has submitted a package on July 13th, which Ty and Bond critiqued in its August 21st memo. Dave Murphy will address that in a little more detail. And the commission also received in yesterday's mail an August 28th letter from the Boston Public Works Department with an attachment. Quincy also submitted an evaluation of the condition of the existing concrete piers by Dr. David Gress, and Duncan Malore from Ty and Bond will summarize the salient points in that memo. I was surprised to hear that there was a that there was a September 5th response to that memo submitted. The city's team wasn't provided a copy of that, so we're not in a position to comment on that. But I feel, before I turn it over to Dave and Duncan, I feel compelled to respond to the city's repetitive mantra in its July 13th letter that the Quincy Conservation Commission has no jurisdiction to demand information, which, by the way, Boston provided most of under protest. And its further audacious claim that the Quincy Conservation Commission should not exercise its authority under its ordinance to require, and I quote from their letter, quote, information and plans as are deemed necessary by the commission to describe the proposed activities and their effects on the environment. Boston doesn't believe you have the authority to demand that sort of information. That's outrageous. The commission should reject the claims that you demand additional information that will allow you to fully assess what are the likely impacts to the wetland resource areas if the piers require more repair, heck, even replacement, if the concrete is not as sound as claimed, without supporting data for that claim. And Duncan will address that technical memo that addresses that work. And you're also entitled to determine what mitigation measures are appropriate and necessary to protect wetland resource areas and wetland interests from the greater repair or replacement of the piers. The impact numbers, the low impact numbers that they're showing you, those are illusory. They're deliberately low, and they don't acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of work to do on those piers to support the structure that they want to put on it. In their memo, they criticize your administration of your own wetland ordinance. There's nothing inappropriate with you administering your ordinance more strictly than the Wetlands Protection Act. They don't want you to, because you have more authority. You can be more strict. In fact, that was the purpose of home rule wetlands laws. Cities and towns were tired of DEP overturning their decisions and second-guessing the judgments that were made under the Wetlands Protection Act. So 231 cities and towns in Massachusetts either have bylaws or ordinances. You have them. You're entitled to exercise that special authority that you have under the ordinance, irrespective of the claim of the city of Boston. Your purview of this project is not limited to the Wetlands Protection Act as they claim. I thought what was most amazing in the August 28th memo was the admission that the plans before you are going to be superseded as, quote, advanced design and construction plans are prepared. How can you approve a project without seeing the final plans for the project? Trust us, it'll be fine. You should not trust that statement. You should see the final plans now, not later. The best management practices are exactly what this commission needs to review. You cannot legally defer the appropriateness of best management practices to the City of Boston's contractor. That's your job, not the contractor being paid for by Boston. You need to know, what are these BMPs? What's going to be proposed? Are they going to work? How are they going to work? Should we approve them? Should we require something more? That's your job, not a contractor's job. I think the audacity of Boston is taken to a new low when in the package of information they submitted to you, they submitted the Boston Conservation Commission's approval order conditions. I'm going to remind you back on June 6th that the Boston Public Works Department was playing on home turf before the Boston Conservation Commission with a local umpire. In fact, there was a pre-negotiated order of conditions even before the hearing was open. And it was agreed to even before the tie and bond memo that was submitted to the Conservation Commission, the ink had a chance to dry. There was one brave commissioner, Alice Richmond, one of the finest trial lawyers that I've met in my career. And she said, I cannot, in good conscience, vote to approve this project when I haven't even had time to review the tie and bond memo. But of course, right now, they submitted that order to you, and I gotta tell you, that order's a nullity. It's been appealed to DEP. It means nothing. Shouldn't mean anything to you. You're not bound to follow what the home team did for the home team. So I ask you, after you hear the presentation of tie and bond, to reject this trust us approach to permitting. If there's a problem, we'll come back before you. You guys ever tried to fix something after it's gone to hell in a handbasket? It ain't easy. People come in kicking and screaming with all sorts of excuses. That shouldn't fall on you. You shouldn't trust them. And you shouldn't trust an unknown general contractor who's going to come up with methods and means and best management practices. Those are for you to decide whether you like them or not. I ask you to demand the show me approach before you even consider granting an approval of this project. However, if the Boston Public Works Department says, this is it, we're not giving you any more information, they refuse to show any more cards, and they want you to close the hearing, do it. And vote to deny the project for failure to provide requested information and for other substantive reasons. So with that, Dave?
If I may, let me just make a correction here. I realize I printed off today a letter from the city, but it was an earlier letter. I don't think you have responded to this, to the September 3rd. Have you?
No, there was no September 5th response.
No, I printed it off September 5th, so that was.
Okay, so there wasn't.
There was not yet a
All
response.
right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is David Murphy. Again, I'm a consultant for the city of Quincy, Ty and Bond, I'm the principal. We have submitted two memos to the commission, one dated June 6th and one dated August 21st. They were very extensive memos. Tonight it doesn't make any sense to go through those in detail. You have those in front of you, they stand on their own. It's important. I just want to touch on two issues, just to highlight some of the issues. Attorney Shea has just mentioned one of them. The BMPs, throughout the document and through the August 28th submittal that you received, the city received yesterday, I believe, it states in there that the contractor will be responsible as they get closer to the final design. They'll pass it on to the contractor to submit means and methods for the BMPs. Well, it's really important that the details of construction means and methods that the contractors, they have to adhere to in order to ensure proper protection of the functions and values of the wetlands. It's not enough to say that you're going to have them prepared by the contractors, and that it's not enough to say that other regulatory agencies allow that to go on. This is the Quincy Conservation Commission. You're fully within your rights to ask for the details of those BMPs. How are the limpets going to be attached to the side of the pier structures? How are you going to correct the lead caulking? How are you going to catch materials that might fall into the water? That's a perfectly legitimate question for you to be asking. It's the responsibility of the commission indeed to handle and see those and approve those BMPs. The Quincy Conservation Commission should not defer to the contractor what will be the way to protect the resource areas. That's one. And again, the memo has a whole bunch of issues, but I'm going to just touch on one of them. The sea level rise. In the submittal that we had on the 28th, again, that was received yesterday, it says that they've designed or they're considering a 3-foot level sea level rise. The Quincy Conservation Commission itself, on their webpage, has a document, and I'll just read a quick paragraph. The City of Boston currently relies on the 2013 report of the Massachusetts Office of the Coastal Zone Management Sea Level Rise, understanding and applying trends, blah, blah. The Commission recommends that applicants prepare for at least the CCM intermediate high scenario for most projects, and the highest scenario for critical facilities and infrastructure. We have to believe that this is critical infrastructure to get over to Long Island. The sea level rise that the Boston Conservation Commission recommends that they design for is 6 feet. They've designed for 3 feet. So the bearings of the base of the bridge will be submerged in water, which is not an acceptable design practice. Ty and Bond remains concerned, as your consultants, that they've not properly addressed and quantified all the impacts to the resource areas, particularly the piers. So with that, I'd like to introduce Duncan Mello from our firm to go through Dr. Gress's conclusions in his reports that was just given to the city several days ago. Duncan?
Thank you. Duncan Mello, Principal Coastal Engineer with Ty and Bond. I got over 30 years experience in evaluating waterfront structures, including granite and concrete. David Gress was a member of our team in helping to review the documents that were provided as part of the submission. One of those was a petrographic analysis that was performed on the concrete cores that were taken out of the piers. Dr. Gress reviewed those reports. There's an Appendix E that was provided that petrographic analysis. He went through that and came up with different conclusions from what they found in that report. One thing, he emphasized the point that the concrete is lacking air entrainment, which are small little bubbles that are entrained into modern concrete that gives the water in the concrete somewhere to go to when it freezes. By not having that, you run the risk of having more freeze-thaw damage. In other words, every time the concrete goes through freeze-thaw cycles, you'll get spalling and cracking of the concrete. They also looked in that study at the chloride concentration, chloride ions in the concrete, and found that they were significantly higher than the levels that would induce corrosion in any steel that's embedded in that concrete. So the rebar that's embedded in that concrete, any post-tensioning they put in, that would all be subject to corrosion due to the chlorides that have already ingressed into that concrete. He also reviewed the photographs that are included in that Appendix E and said that they clearly indicate visually ASR and freeze-thaw damage that's occurred in that concrete. Looking at the photographs of the cores, he emphasized the fact that the cores appear to be more fractured, closer to the granite, and it's more to the outside of the concrete. A lot of the testing was done on the portion of the concrete cores that was taken further on the interior of the pier. It's anticipated that this will be a progressive type of deterioration that would occur to the concrete. That deterioration is going to start from the outside where it's exposed to the water and the freeze-thaw most heavily and progress inward and accelerate over time. Dr. Gress's opinion was that the cost-effective life expectancy of these piers has already expired. They're approximately 70 years old. The city of Boston is looking to get another 75 years out of them. So, on the order of 150-year life they're expecting to get out of this concrete. It's got both the alkali-silica reaction, which is essentially like a cancer of concrete. It's typically caused by the reactive aggregates, the stones that are used in the concrete. That's clearly showing up in the photographs that were in the Appendix E report, with what they call the reaction rings around the aggregate. What happens with that is when the ASR, the reaction that goes on there with that aggregate, is exposed to moisture, it starts to expand the concrete, and so you get cracking of the concrete. The more cracking you get, the more water intrusion you get, and it progresses its way into the concrete of the bridge pier. This is a significant concern, and his basis for his opinion that the concrete has already reached the end of its life expectancy. He did note that the ASR and the freeze-thaw damage is expected to actually accelerate over time. Again, with that cracking and the ability of the water to get inside the concrete of the pier, that reaction, the cracking of the concrete, the expansion of the concrete is expected to accelerate over time. So you can't just make a linear projection because it's already survived 70 years, it will last another 75. At the end of that report, Dr. Gress does make some recommendations for additional testing that he thinks are important to look at, those peer reuse, to see what kind of quality that concrete is and whether or not his opinions on this review of the Appendix E report are founded. He recommends more coring of the concrete that would be more extensive around the pier, in greater depth into the pier, and then also non-destructive testing to look at delaminations and cracks that are occurring inside the concrete. So those would be tests that he recommends be done on the piers to make sure that they can be reused for new structure.
Would you like us to respond to that now, or take other testimony? What's your preference?
Is there any other testimony from city consultants? Let's get a response to that, and then we'll ask.
I'm assuming that we'll see from our law department who will address some of the jurisdictional issues, and Nicole Bulger will come back on sea level rise and the pier structures.
Thank you, Chief. My name is Sammy Nabolsi. I'm with the City of Boston Law Department, and I just want to address a couple of points that were brought up by John Shea. I won't repeat anything we have in the documents. First I want to clarify the response that the city made. That was just not a correct reading of the response. And if you look at I'll point you to the exact spots, you can read it for yourselves, but it's the August 28th letter. And I think John is pointing at the last paragraph on page 1 of attachment A, where the city said, in addition, we just assert that it is premature to request the advanced design and construction phase means and methods information identified in the memo, And then we actually say that the Quincy Wetlands Protection Ordinance itself only requires information and plans as are deemed necessary by the commission. So we're not telling you you do not have the ability to request information and plans. We're telling you that the local wetlands ordinance requires us, upon request of the commission, to provide you the plans as we propose the work. The city is not trying to hide the ball or keep anything away from the commission. The fact of the matter is we don't have final plans yet. Why? It's not so we're asking the Quincy Conservation Commission and the Boston Conservation Commission to rely on our contractor, but we just know, as is the ordinary course in permitting, that as we go to the conservation commissions, as we go through the state permitting procedures, and even here as we go through Coast Guard and Department of Army approvals, there will be additional conditions attached. And until we know what all the requirements are of the different permitting authorities, then we can prepare a spec sheet and say, hey, contractor, not only are these our requirements, but these are also the requirements of the Quincy Conservation Committee and Commission in the City of Quincy, the requirements of the Boston Conservation Commission, the requirements of the MEPA office, the requirements of the Department of Environmental Protection, the requirements of Coastal Zone Management, the requirements of Coast Guard, so on and so forth, all of the agencies that we are proposing and showing this project to. And so that's why we don't have final plans for you today, because what you do here today dictates our final plans. And we are happy to provide those to you when we have them. In fact, one suggestion I would make is that, and this is what we did with Boston, we're happy to do it here, is that the City of Quincy, as a condition in the order of conditions, that before the city begins work, that we provide the commission with all final plans and designs. And if the commission sees that there's been a change in an alteration to an impact area, or our impact areas have increased from what is originally proposed, then yes, we need to appear before the Quincy Conservation Commission on basically what is an amended order of conditions. And we recognize that, and we're prepared to add that to the order of conditions if need be. The other thing I'll say is that pointing to the impacts that we identified here, it's not up, but you have in your presentations, it's actually correct. I agree with John. Those are deliberately low. The reason they're deliberately low is because we deliberately designed a project to minimize environmental impacts. Those are accurate numbers. It may be the case that if you add the square footage of the work we're doing on the piers above the water and in the dry, technically there's an increase to square footage, but again, the Quincy Conservation Commission, this is when we go back to purview, reviews alterations that we propose to resource areas. That's not just under the Wetlands Protection Act, but the local wetlands ordinance in Quincy says that if we do an alteration, lists the different ways in which one can alter a resource area, and then it points to the Massachusetts General Laws 131, Section 40. And so that's where that point is coming from. And so when it comes to the impacts to resource areas as defined by both the Wetlands Protection Act and the local wetlands ordinance, those are accurate numbers. They are only low because we've decided to create a path forward that minimizes environmental impacts. And the last thing, I just want to address the comment that was made about the Boston Conservation Commission. Yes, Alice Richmond is wonderful. And the way the Boston proceedings has been described to you is not actually what happened. So at the May meeting, where the Boston Conservation Commission first received the memo that was provided by Ty and Bond in the city of Quincy and begun deliberations, they chose not to vote that night because of the statement made by Alice Richmond. So what they did is they closed the hearing on public testimony and then continued their deliberations and left it open so that they can come back on June 6th. And it was on June 6th that they then had further deliberations. Presumably by then the commission had 2 weeks, maybe a little longer, to review the submission, and then they took a vote that night, and they issued an order of conditions that is fairly standard as far as orders of conditions go. Yes, that order of conditions has been appealed by Mr. Shea in the city of Quincy. It's pending at DEP. It's not technically a nullity. It stops work until DEP either issues a superseding order of conditions or denies the project, or it's the possibility that DEP says that they can't look at this matter, in which case it brings back to life the Boston order of conditions. But that's not really relevant here, right? The commission can issue its own order of conditions and can condition the project as we've stated. And so now I'm going to turn over to Nicole Bulger, who will talk a little bit about the information that we received, I believe, today And then also address the sea level rise issue as well.
I just wanted to quickly touch on the sea level rise question. I know, right, we've all seen how many numbers there are out there for sea level rise forecasts and what percentages. And this actually was discussed, it was discussed with the Boston Conservation Commission as well. It's a very important issue to them. So what we show on this figure is a 40-inch sea level rise. If you look at a 72-inch sea level rise, what you see is that this is our roadway elevation. So 40 inches is what's shown here between the existing mean-high water and what would be proposed. That's our 40 inches. So if we double that, you see that really our bearings and our bridge deck are still above that elevation. So it's not something that's going to actually be flooding this roadway and blocking access to critical infrastructure. And then related to the, I'll take this back. You just heard a lot about the concrete report that we all recently received with an explanation on ASR and fluorides. I think one of the most important points from our perspective is related to the purview of the person who is offering that report and the fact that the design that we described to you for the piers was not included in that. So the city has reviewed the report and specifically the comments related to the structural integrity of the substructures. It should be noted that bridge piers of this age and older are regularly kept in service and rehabilitated for reuse in the Boston area, for example, on Summer Street, and throughout the country. The items in the report that have merit are addressed by the extensive testing program already performed and by the city's proposed design as presented in the notice of intent filing. Although apparently not reviewed by the report author, the design as presented includes rebuilding and repairing existing abutments, removing existing exposed concrete on piers, repointing and repairing pier granite facing, installing post-tension strengthening bars within the substructure cores, and placing new reinforced concrete pier caps. The proposed modifications will be in accordance with current codes and standards applicable to bridge design and rehabilitation, and the rehabilitated substructures will serve the community for the proposed 75-year design. And we actually have, at the end of the presentation, we went over these back in June. Other relevant projects, bridges are rehabilitated, substructures are rehabilitated around the country and in this area frequently.
Any other comments?
Yeah, it's just a brief statement. Ty and Bond never said that the piers were resource areas. They're structures within and above resource areas. That was the point in their memo. And as to the footprint, way back when, probably June 6th, we explained that more usual construction methodology around these piers, especially if significant amount of repairs or replacements are needed, was the use of coffer dams. You guys know about coffer dams, you can see them all. Instead, they want to hang bags off the side to catch debris. The reason we say these numbers are not accurate is that if you take the standard coffer dam design around the circumference of these piers to allow dewatering and to allow the repair to depth, is that there will be a greater impact to wetland resource areas and to land under water. So those were the only 2 points of disagreement. I'd urge again this commission to demand the information that you need to evaluate whether or not these real concerns by the city's consultants and by Dr. Giss are accurate. Last point. I was at the Boston Compound hearing. The order of conditions was pre-negotiated In fact, they turned to the applicant and said, what do you think? Well, I'd like to change this and this. There wasn't any evaluation in the tie-in bond memo. Yeah, they closed the hearing, and then they held a public hearing, and they did their deliberation, but it was on the approval order of conditions. So I think that's a little cute to try to say that they gave it full faith and review of the tie-in bond. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? You,
I'm good, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
did you have a recommendation?
Excuse me?
Do you have a recommendation?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Testimony.
Go ahead.
Good evening. My name's Bill Harris. I'm the Ward 6 City Councilor, and I represent the people who are going to be directly affected by if this project goes through. I'm really going to make a mistake because I'm going to go off script. I usually prepare myself, but I heard some things tonight that kind of disturbed me. The attorney, I'm sorry I don't know her name, he used the phrase, hide the ball. And then the representative for the city also mentioned that there was going to be a recovery center. So what winds up happening is when someone like myself and other members of government go up against a city like Boston, who's not following the guidelines of what our city does. But I just recently found out that Boston isn't even following their own guidelines when it comes to community meetings and the community that some of the folks represent. They're ignoring what the people are saying. They don't care about the folks here. They want to use a word, recovery center, and if we go against it, we look like bad guys. My God, we need more recovery centers throughout this country, throughout our city, throughout Boston. They could have recovery centers right now going on. They could have a ferry right now going right out. I went out to dinner at Spectacle Island. It was wonderful. They voted out 150 people, gave them a clam bake. We had a clam bake, and we were home in 2 hours. So to throw something at a community without telling us what's going to be there, without showing us the plans of what's there, without following what procedures we go through. Now, I'm going to have some work done on my house. I'm going to have to come possibly in front of you folks, right? That's the rules. We follow the rules. We have community meetings when projects, this is community meetings with this size project. And for us being the people of my ward, and not only my ward, the city of Quincy, which will be affected. Not only the city of Quincy, it'll affect the traffic going all the way from Hull over to Boston, which I drive in each day. So, hide the ball, folks, they've hit the ball. And they haven't followed the procedures. I've written a letter, I got the same response. So I respectfully hope that you folks hear what our attorneys and Ty and Bond have said, and of course the report, the press report, makes it clear. And I'm now going to even get myself in more trouble. There's a road which leads, I'd love to see it, which leads, Moon Island Road. I'm going to get myself in a lot of trouble. Moon Island Road has 16 orange barrels. I have photographs of the asphalt of that road. It's about a quarter mile up from the guard shack, which doesn't even come close to where the first pier is. The asphalt, you know what it's made of, and it's been there forever. It's crumbling into the ocean. You can see exposed, I have a picture, exposed conduit, electrical conduit. Before they can even go to this point, they gotta fix that road. And they have to come before you folks. And you have to protect our environment. Please, the young lady spoke about making sure containment. Right now, they're not containing Moon Island Road. Asphalt is falling in as trucks and vehicles go to Moon Island as we speak. I humbly thank you. I'd like to introduce Representative Bruce Hayes.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. I've attended both the hearings, and I'm extremely disappointed to hear the comments of Mr. Murphy, Mr. Shea. I think the mayor's team did a great job in their due diligence to try to come up with information, and to hear that they think that you should demand information for basic, legitimate questions on this proposal is very disturbing. It's disturbing for me, it's disturbing for our constituents. All along, we've been asking for how this is going to impact the lead contamination, the erosion, the marine life, the wetlands impacts, and then to hear tonight the additional concerns of the egress concrete. And Boston had alluded to that it was 50 years old, but it's more like 75 years old. And Ms. Bellinger indicated that the steel pouring would go into that, and I think would only cause more damage, more erosion, more destruction. To see the New England weather climates where you have freezing and thawing is only going to be more destructive to that. So as the state representative of this area, I would urge you to oppose this. I am strongly in opposition to this. I'm strongly opposed to it because of the way that this proposal has been brought out by the city of Boston, the lack of information they provided to the board, and the consideration to the residents of Squantum and North Quincy on this issue.
Just one last thing. I would recommend to the board that you may want to request that the city provide a professional report stamped by a professional engineer in the Commonwealth that addresses the concerns raised in Dr. Gress's report.
Any other comments? Consideration by the board. My concern from the first June hearing was, alternatives analysis was whether we agree with it or not, that's not really our jurisdiction, but the pier deterioration and whether it's adequately addressed in terms of what's going on with those piers and whether we're going to have temporary protective structures if there's below the water repair or coffer dams, which is no impact. And what concerns are there?
Well, they have information they have not about the city, is that correct?
Well, according to the Gress report, he's requesting additional testing in addressing this report. You've only just received it.
If it is useful, though, the team can speak to sort of the accredited testing that's already been done and the source of that testing. That's useful for you.
To address that.
So many of the statements that were in the Gress report, William Goulet.
We didn't have it for you, I'm sorry. William.
Goulet, G-O-U-L-E-T. We reviewed the report that Gress was provided to us via tie and bonds. What we had provided in our structures report, which is part of what he reviewed, what he listed in documents wasn't our full structures report. It did not include our proposed alterations. A good portion of the concrete that he refers to as exposed concrete that is being demolished, that's being replaced. Some of the parts of that report that he goes into depth on, the Tetra analysis. All of the test results that were put into our report that he reviewed are from an accredited AASHTO testing facility, an independent facility. They classified all the ASR as minor and not degradation to the structural capacity of the concrete. So there can be a discussion further on with us and them, but we have provided substantial testing that's been run through an accredited facility by AASHTO, which controls bridge design here in the state and across the nation. So to that regard, we don't see all of the points that he has made as valid points.
But that's the information that you have that hasn't been shared to us.
I believe the structures report has.
It was contained within documentation that was provided earlier this summer.
Do you have any, I know it's recent, but do you have any response to the recommendation for this additional coring testing?
We believe what we've done for testing, coring, we've cored every pier. Some piers have had multiple cores done. What we've done is in standard practice for standard reuse of bridges. It's typical. What we have done is the level of effort that's put into it. And we've received favorable results from the testing that has been done, which would not suggest that more testing is required.
Well, our consultant thinks that additional testing is required, and if there is information you have or information you can supply, can we address it to this report?
Again, we used an accredited facility for testing, and they gave us their results and their analysis of it.
I think he wants a response to the report.
We can. We're just gonna say this is the results that we provided that he reviewed. They're from an accredited association, controlled by AASHTO, accredited by AASHTO. That is what standard practice would give you as a result. That would be our response to the questions that he's raising.
Chairman, it would actually be really helpful to say, answering your question or providing information to kind of know a bit more about the interest, right? So in that report identifies, we disagree with it, and there's been testing that documentation has been provided, but it's really about the existing piers and the type of reactions or what have you that are happening with the salt water in the area. Obviously, the proposed work, and it's not happening in the water, it's all happening in the dry, resolves those issues as proposed, and that's part of our notice of intent. So I guess what we are curious about is from the Quincy Conservation Commissions, whether it be the local ordinance or the state act, the concerns that are brought up in that memo, from your perspective, how is it then tied to work being done in a resource area?
I think we're concerned about the future of that resource area.
So
if they're not structurally sound, or if these bridges will only last 10 years because of the degradation of the concrete, it's something we're gonna have to deal with 10 years down the road, not 70 years like you're hoping. So.
Right, so is your concern that, I just wanna make sure I have it right.
No, I understand.
Is your concern that we are going to be back here in 10 years trying to build a new bridge, or is your concern
I think
that
our
the bridge?
concern is to protect the resource area,
Right, but I guess how is it being harmed?
the potential for it to be harmed.
If these deteriorate, I think it's really, if these deteriorate quicker than you project, then there will be deterioration into the resource area, and there'll have to be more work done.
You're worried about, in the future, pieces falling off the piers?
Or redoing these piers entirely, which then you're getting into the seabed area. Things that you're trying to minimize now, you may make worse by not correcting these problems. Is that, I mean, I'm not the engineer, but I think that's a legitimate concern of ours, which is, you're balancing something by not doing new piers now, saying, okay, that'll be less impact, but if they have to be new piers in 10 years, then you can increase the impact. Is that a fair way to say it?
Right, so it sounds like your concern is really that if we, despite what's been provided, right, if all of that is wrong, the concern is we're coming back in 10 years to put in new piers.
And then well, in the meantime, there's deterioration of these piers, and then you're impacting the flow once again.
So coming back on new piers and deterioration of these piers, which I guess includes things falling into the water. Is that what you mean by deterioration and impacting resource areas?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
And I will defer a little bit to our consultants, because they're the engineers, so let me ask,
Yeah, just on that question of adequate testing, one of the things that Dr. Gress had mentioned was that they had not taken.
identify yourselves again for the record, just so.
Duncan Miller from Taiwan. Dr. Gress had mentioned that there were no cores taken underwater, and one of the aspects of alkali silica reaction expansion is the presence of water. If it's in a dry environment, it will not expand, but when you put that into water, you need that water to get the gel for the ASR to actually start to swell and expand and crack the concrete. So we certainly have found it many times before where there is significant cracking in concrete underwater caused by alkali silica reaction. The study that they did not take any cores from underwater.
Okay, I guess that was something I was wondering about their study. Is that true?
Yes, we did not do any underwater cores. One of the actual areas that's the highest accelerated ASR reaction areas is where you have wetting and drying. Wetting and drying causes alkali migration into the concrete. Alkali is what actually is the salt component that drives the ASR reaction. So actually in the splash zone is a lot of times where you have the highest concentrations, the buildups of ASR reaction.
Don't you think you'd be covering your bases by just testing those areas that you didn't test?
Again, what we've done so far is standard practice.
I guess
that
standard practice is just that.
I think just
If we can-
just quickly to clarify, we tested in the tidal zone,
Yeah.
so that's what he was trying to say. Is that you didn't test entirely underwater, you tested in the area that gets this
About the
exposure
splash.
inconsistent.
yes.
Right.
So it gets the wetting, and usually that's where you'll see the most accelerated portions. It's not constantly wet, so the gel isn't constantly expanded. As he's talking about is where it's underwater, it's always expanded, but you don't get the same rate of reaction underwater as you can in some of these other areas. So I wouldn't say that one area is more conservative than the other to take the core underwater or above or in the splash zone. We think the splash zone is representative of what would be in the piers.
Well, I mean, we would like a response to this, this project's not gonna happen tomorrow, so we would like a response to Dr. Gress's report. And if your response is, here's our tests, we think that's adequate, that's your response. If your response is, we'll do some testing underwater, then that'll be your response. But we would, it's a concern of ours, and I think it's legitimately in the resource area.
Mr. Chairman, just one point from me. Don't be locked into you're concerned about 10 years down the road. Our concern is right now. If you have to do the repairs that we think need to be done, then the footprint area now is going to be larger.
I'm sorry, in terms of, then you're gonna have to do the damming rather than.
Right. I mean, it's a legitimate concern 10 years down the road, but we're really talking about the work as proposed right now.
Because the proposal is not to use cofferdams right now? Is that the proposal?
That's correct.
That's correct.
Okay. And if you could address that, which is, we don't believe we should use cofferdams for this reason, because that is more protective, but it affects more of the resources.
Nicole did cover some of it on the fly.
No, we do not think that it's necessary to use cofferdams, and as Sammy mentioned, we deliberately designed this project to have the minimum impact possible for the reuse of these piers. We are not
But I think-
proposing cofferdams, we do not.
I appreciate that, but I think the point of our consultants is, if the deterioration is more significant than you think below water, you might have to use cofferdams.
In that case, we would have to come back before you with a new proposed design.
If we do the testing now, maybe we'll know.
No, we have done sufficient testing to show what's required. If anything
Well-
were to change down the road, we would have to come back before you. We do not anticipate that to occur. We have done extensive testing that's typical for this type of treatment.
I don't think we're prepared to vote yet without a response to this letter. Either whether it's, here's a test, that's it, or here's what more we're going to do.
I just wanted to note, if you look at that Appendix E, which is the petrographic analysis of the concrete, that was performed. I believe you'll see that it was signed by a lab manager and a field technician. So there was no professional registration or stamp on that. So it appeared that they were making structural determinations about the adequacy of the concrete, when they may not have been qualified to be making that determination. So that's why we're just asking.
That would be addressed in the response to this.
Correct.
Is that, so at this point, are you satisfied to give us a response at our next meeting?
No, so our intent is actually not to continue this particular item. That will trigger the 21 days, and so we will give you a response within that 21-day window.
Okay.
Essentially starting that 21-day shot clock to be able to allow us to be able to get that final response back to you, and then we look forward to your vote between now and the 26th. And there's other information or other things that you can do and come back according between now and the 26th. And have it.
Is that adequate for the board?
I think we ought to continue this to the next meeting and give everybody a chance to get all the
Well, what,
information and contradictions and everything else.
I mean, if you're gonna give us the response, we have to have a vote.
Right. Well, basically what we're saying, Chairman, is that we do not agree to a continuance until next month. What we're saying is under the Act,
Yeah,
you have 21 days to make a decision and issue a determination. Tomorrow, so in our preliminary structures report, we have the testing and it's stamped. We'll send that to you tomorrow. That gives you, and the 21-day clock starts tomorrow, so you have the full 21 days to read it, look at it, and get back in this room in compliance with open meeting law, and we expect a determination by the 26th of September.
So they're asking you to close the hearing tonight, not to be able to have this reported information be part of the record that would be forming the basis for a decision.
Chairman, that's incorrect. We're not asking you to close the hearing tonight. You have 21 days to issue a determination. If we meet in 2 weeks, right, you can continue the hearing for 2 weeks, or actually even 3 weeks from now. It gives you a tight timeline to draft your determination. So maybe in 2.5 weeks, whatever you need. But we're basically saying, we'll come back in 2 weeks, public hearing continues. Mr. Shea and his consultants may submit another response to our response, and we'll have that discussion then. But in any event, we're expecting a determination within 21 days from tonight.
Well, then, so essentially you're asking us to have no further meetings, because we only have our meetings once a month.
He's asking you to have a meeting,
Have another
21
meeting.
days is almost the next meeting anyway.
but that's the law.
But the law says 21 days from the close of the public hearing for you to issue a decision. Not receive something else and the 21 days starts tonight. It starts from when you close the hearing.
And we're not prepared to close the hearing yet.
I think there's more information to come in.
Well, I just then want to note that the city objects to a continuance of the hearing.
Okay.
We can have a vote?
You're gonna, oh, wait, wait.
No, I have a vote to continue the hearing.
If you're gonna have some information on concrete out of this report, or responses out of this report to us, I'd also like to see some responses to the photographs that shows the granite exterior pulling apart. And specifically photo 37, which shows the concrete cracked, literally falling apart.
Those photographs are actually taken from our report.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
Those photographs are taken from our report. We're aware of that, and that has led to the rehabilitation design. This was the basis, the information that he reviewed formed the basis for our structural design to rehabilitate those structures. That's why you see that we're removing some of the concrete, we're repointing and repairing the granite facing, we're replacing, we're adding in the strengthening. All of those things were not reviewed by Dr. Gress. He did not receive that information. We provided it to you and to Tag and Bond, but they did not give it to him, it appears. It's not part of the documentation he reviewed.
I mean, he took the photographs, and he's aware of your report.
That was the preliminary structures report. They did not provide him with the additional information about what was being changed as part of the proposed project.
Well, I think that can be addressed in the response. We don't have to delay it today. But at this point, I think we're going to,
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
yes, so,
For the record, Jay Duker, I'm the Director of Inspectional Services. As your conservation agent, I make a recommendation that you close the public hearing tonight and vote it down for lack of information. Thank you.
what is the board's, they're demanding a vote within 21 days, and objecting to our continuance.
But again, reiterate our willingness to provide answers to your specific question, after this.
But are you objecting to a continuance?
That's correct.
I think we have to take a vote.
Yes, close the hearing.
Okay, I know, we take a vote to close the hearing and
The basic thing is to close the hearing and issue negative order conditions.
for
For
not
lack
having
of, for
lack
lack
of
of
information
detail.
and substantive concerns about the structures.
Yeah.
Okay,
All right.
there was a second?
I
That was
make
your
a
motion, that was your
I make a
motion. Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, that starts the process. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to clarify, that's under both state and local wetlands ordinance?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have anything else on the agenda? Hold on, before we get on. One more? I hope so.
Well, Capuano, right, you know, so.
Well, you know what?
You know, you're
The neighborhood has changed. Okay, we're still